Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share, and restack buttons. Well, Jesus said to watch for this end times sign. And we talked about this last week, I believe it was. There's been some breaking news, so we're going to talk about what's going on with that. But first, I want to turn your attention to this in case you've missed it. So this is the latest article up on the Substack. This went up yesterday. It's titled How to Deal with End Times Apathy. So if you're not signed up to the Substack and you aren't getting emails, but you want to read this, make sure to head over to brittgillette.substack.com. You can check that out. You can also sign up if you don't want to miss those updates. You'll get videos like this directly to your email inbox, and you can watch the video right there in your email if you so choose. So again, brittgillette.substack.com. Check out the latest article, just went up yesterday. Also, if you missed it on Monday, I had the pleasure of being on Hope for Our Times with Pastor Tom Hughes. If you want to watch that, you can head over to his YouTube channel. Make sure to hit the live tab, and you'll see that program right there. We talked about the precarious position of the U.S. dollar and the U.S. military. So that's definitely one to check out. If you're not subscribed to Tom's channel, head over and check that out. If you don't want to watch this on YouTube, you can also go to the Hope for Our Times website. Look at the live stream tab. You'll get whatever the latest live stream is, as well as most recent ones, and you can find it there. There's also a Hope for Our Times app that you can check out if you want to go download that. And then you have all of these things available on your mobile device whenever you want them. You can check out any of Tom's programs on that. So, Jesus said to watch for this end time sign. What am I talking about? Well, last week we talked about famine. So Jesus talked about famine, earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars, and all of these things are just the beginning of birth pains, meaning we're going to see things like this. It doesn't mean that they're tribulation events, but we should expect to see these occurring like birth pains, meaning with more frequency, with greater intensity. And so that means that we are going to see famines, and we have seen famines for centuries, but we will most likely see famines before the rapture occurs. It doesn't mean we're going to see the global famine and what we see described in Revelation 6. I believe that's a tribulation event. And it doesn't mean we're going to see, famine everywhere. However, I believe what we're seeing now and what's to come impacts everybody on the planet, because it's going to lead to food shortages, and it's going to mean that while there may not be an actual lack of food available, depending on where you live, and that's the key, we'll see those food prices continue to go upward. And if you're in a poorer country that imports the majority of its food, that's where we would see the prospect for massive famine. So what has changed since we talked about this a little over a week ago, I believe it was? Well, we have this right here. This is from the South China Morning Post. It's titled, China Faces Diluted Early Season Rice Harvest as Floods Drench Crops and Farming Hubs. It says, rainfall in China's hubs for early season rice threatens to reduce the year's grain output, presenting a challenge to the country's efforts to maintain food security. It says China is set to see a drop in its early season rice harvest after recent bouts of extreme rainfall in major production areas, putting pressure on annual output at a time when Beijing is fighting to strengthen its food security. So last summer they had massive flooding that impacted the growing season last year this time. So now we're seeing this again. It says the crop to be gathered later this month and estimated to account for 13% of China's total rice production is sprouting prematurely in the southern and eastern areas of the country after heavy rains have persisted since mid-June, according to local farmers and agriculture analysts. A highly likely decrease in output underscores the growing challenge presented by climate change, well, by the weather, guys, by weather, as China endeavors to ensure food self-sufficiency, an issue of strategic significance for the country's 1.4 billion people as geopolitical uncertainties accumulate. It's unusual to see so much rain in this season, and rice crops located in low-lying areas have been flooded, so a reduction in output this year is almost certain, said Ding Yong, a farmer from Shengying County in Hunan Province, one of the 4 hub areas where China's early rice is grown. So let's unpack a little bit of this. 13% of China's total rice production. Now, I can't imagine all of that's going to be wiped out, but it may be a significant hit to that. Let's say that it's, 10%. Well, that's 1.3% of the overall rice production. But keep in mind, China doesn't export any rice at all. It's an importer, an importer of rice. So all the rice that China grows domestically, it consumes all of it and then more. So any loss of production, when we're talking 1.3% of its rice production possibly lost in this, and we don't know what those figures are going to be, but that's feeding 1.4 billion people. So we're talking one of the largest rice producers in the world, one of the largest rice consumers in the world. So that has to be made up for elsewhere. And as we've noted before, India has had some weather-related issues, and on certain types of rice, they imposed export bans, which is significant because India is responsible for 40% of the world's rice exports. And so as we see something like this happen, it tells us, again, not necessarily that there's going to be outright famine in China. I don't expect that this will lead to famine in China, but this is going to accelerate demand for imported rice and drive up prices for other countries that are less able to afford it. Say, for instance, Bangladesh. Bangladesh has a per capita income that is much lower than China. Therefore, they can't compete in the open market when it comes to bidding on rice and other agricultural commodities. So we're going to see the poorer nations left out, especially, again, those nations that are importing the majority of their food and have a low per capita income. Think a nation like Egypt, again, Bangladesh. There are many others, and many of those countries, many African nations that are already on that world hunger list and that watch list for famine, that are at the famine line right now. Unfortunately, we're going to see food prices go up as a result of events like this, and that causes a major problem because it worsens an existing crisis, as we see here. This is from last month in Zero Hedge. It says global food prices rise for third straight month, fueling instability risk in the developing world. Again, when we're talking famine, we're talking in what you would call the developing world. I don't expect that we'll see food shortages as a result of something like this in a place like the United States, but we will see prices affected globally. So everyone is going to be paying more. Says the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations reported that global food prices increased for the third consecutive month in May. This rise was driven by higher prices for cereals and dairy products, which outweighed declines in sugar and vegetable oil prices. The reacceleration of food price growth should be a cause for concern among policymakers. The Food Price Index, which tracks the international prices of a basket of globally traded food commodities, averaged 120.4 in May, marking a 0.9% increase from its revised April level. Despite this rise, the index is still 3% lower than a year ago and 24.9% below its peak in March 2022. However, the index has reversed some losses over the past several months and turned higher. And again, this is off of the highs we saw 2 years ago. But when we look at this, even the floor on this is still at levels that were the previous 30-year highs. And again, this area here was followed by the Arab Spring, if you remember that. So you had social unrest throughout the Middle East. Egypt actually had a change in leadership as a result of that. So with these elevated food prices for the length of time we've seen, going on over 2 years now, we would expect to see, if this continues, we're going to see social unrest. And that's what they talk about in this story here. Again, they always bury the lead at the bottom. And they even say that here. It says the bigger story here. Okay, why didn't you make the bigger story the top of the story? It says the bigger story here is global food prices are beginning to rise once again. This is potentially catastrophic for emerging market economies where currencies are moving lower and inversely food prices are moving higher. Folks in these countries have to allocate higher percentages of their incomes to food purchases, and the increase in that only produces financial stress. In return, higher food prices increase the risk of social instability. And again, they're talking general food prices here. Again, rice, when we think about what's happening in China, we can look at rice prices. And here, certainly well off of all-time highs from over a decade ago, from April 2008. But again, I would point out what happened after that. Well, we saw a global recession not long after that, the great financial crisis. Because if people have to expend an ever-increasing amount of their income just to survive, then they're not going to buy all of the things that aren't necessary for survival. And that's going to cause problems for all of those goods and services providers worldwide who provide those things. But here we see certainly prices in general that are much higher than they've been for the past 10 to 12 years. And this isn't accounting for the floods we just read about in China, which are going to have a major impact. So, and another bigger story, they even mentioned this, I believe, in the previous story about geopolitical uncertainties accumulate. So it's not just the weather that's affecting food prices, but it's also things like the Russia invasion of Ukraine that has caused a spike in fertilizer prices. It's also led to decreased exports of grain from Ukraine, which is breadbasket of the world, and in many ways like one of the leading exporting agricultural providers in the entire world. And so it shows how fragile this global supply chain is. And I believe when we read in Revelation 6, when the tribulation does occur, and we see that those famine conditions where a day's wages will purchase just a subsistence diet of food, I believe that's going to come as a result of the war that occurs earlier in Revelation 6 that breaks these different supply chains. We got a slight glimpse of that in 2020 with the shutdowns that occurred globally. But what happens when you have shutdowns from war? You have a broken supply chain because a war escalates. You have war on a global scale, as we read about in Revelation 6. Then you can see, well, if you don't have a local food source, you're dependent on the supply chain to bring you your food, then it can be cut off very quickly. And so this just underscores what we're seeing here, how fragile that system is. They also, I think, talked about, well, sustainable measures. They won't say, well, what we're trying over this climate change ideology, they're shutting down local farms. Of course, those are being consolidated into these corporate giants, which gives them control. Is that simply by chance, or is it part of a greater agenda? And we have to wonder, is there a greater agenda coming forward? And I would say we need to be aware of that possibility, because if you haven't noticed, there's this site right here, Food Alert, stress testing the EU food system. So this is a group that's gotten together and said, well, let's have a war game scenario and figure out what if, we're just asking a what if, there weren't food on the shelves at the grocery store in the European Union. How would that all play out? But keep in mind, it's just a what if. They're not planning anything, right? Be aware. I'm just putting this out there because they had a wargaming at the FDIC in late 2022. What would happen if there's a banking crisis? And then in March, we have a banking crisis. And they've done war games in the past where they said, let's have a hypothetical scenario where Russia invades Ukraine. And then they've had war games where, let's say there's a coronavirus that leads to this pandemic. And then a few months later, we have that. So I'm just saying, I would keep this in the back of my mind that there are people wargaming this. It says, project partners designed Food Alert to be a practical and direct means to help bridge the gap between policy analysis and practical application by those involved in the complex process of transforming food systems. Transforming food. Who's trying to transform the food systems? Well, they are. They're telling us that. And the idea came to life in 2023 as an effort to strengthen food systems, particularly their resilience to external stressors and shocks caused by increasingly severe weather and related sustainability challenges. That's a good way of saying, yeah, our policies are forbidding that you have cows. Our policies are shutting down family farms in the Netherlands. And our policies are trying to take away water from farmers in Idaho. And all around the world, the policies related to their sustainability, they call it related sustainability challenges. That's coming from their policies, not the weather, but from their policies, is causing this. And so they go on and they put together this Food Alert report. And I'll put a link to this, so if you want to go read it, you can check this out, just to be sure what everybody is up to. But as part of this, they put out this video, and I want to play a couple of excerpts of that so that you can just get an idea of how they envision things, because it tends to be that when we see these hypothetical scenarios, we're just, what would we do? What would happen if this happened? Well, later it tends to happen. So you might want to pay attention and be aware of what's going to happen. So let me mute my mic here, and I'll play this in a second. The beginning of this, again, I'll put a link to this as well if you want to go watch this in its entirety. It's about 5 minutes long. The beginning part of it, they have these emergency phone calls and this foreboding music. It's supposed to scare you. Oh, there's no food anywhere. Again, I don't know that we'll see something like that this side of the tribulation period, but we could see it in local areas, as they're discussing here. And in this case, they're saying this is an EU problem. So if you live in the EU, just be aware that you're in the crosshairs of what these people want to do. And we'll talk in a moment about maybe why it is that they want to do that. And it has nothing to do with climate change or the weather. It has to do with power and control. So let's take a look at this right here. Let me unmute this and mute my mic and I'll play.
Food shortages around Europe. Supermarket shelves are empty. People in many countries experience it for the first time in their lives. Many people took to the streets, and in some countries, there are even food riots.
The crisis started in 2024 when the supply of soil from Brazil and palm oil from Indonesia stopped.
Ich hätte nie gedacht, dass es für mich und meine Kinder in Deutschland schwierig sein würde, Fleisch, Fisch und andere grundlegende Lebensmittel zu finden.
All right, so let me stop right there and we'll comment on what we just saw. So first off, I never dreamed in Germany that the shelves would be empty. Well, it's only been 4 years since a lot of the shelves were empty. They may not have been completely empty, but they were empty. And then, of course, notice what they say. It all began in 2024. Like it did? Are they trying to telegraph something? Are they trying to tell us something? I don't know. But you might want to prepare just in case. But then they end on this note right here. So let me mute my mic again and hit play on this.
We are all in this together. Let's get back to the negotiation table and we will find a way out of this crisis. Maybe it is an opportunity.
Okay, so did you catch that? That was right before that. They have the bad music playing, right? And there's this woman's voice, and she's saying we need to close our borders, and we need to keep the food for ourselves and feed our own people, right? That's wrong. They're trying to telegraph that's wrong. How dare you try to feed your own people and take care of your own people? And then the good music comes on, and they say, we need to work together, come to the negotiating table. We need to hold hands and come to the conclusion we want to come to. Because this is an opportunity, right? That's how they see this. They see, let's create a crisis. That's an opportunity, right? An opportunity for what? An opportunity for them to take control. Because how can you show this? And again, if you go watch this video, it's just this wall-to-wall panic of there's no food and there's riots taking place and people are fighting each other. And then at the end, beautiful music. This is an opportunity, right? How do you go from that to, hey, it's an opportunity? Well, the way you do that is if you're planning to engineer the crisis in order to take advantage of it for power. And this is certainly not unprecedented. Let's look at the Bible and see what happened in the Bible. If we go back to the book of Genesis, chapter 47, verses 13 through 21, you can read about the famine in Egypt and how Joseph, on Pharaoh's behalf, led Egypt and the surrounding world through that famine at that time and what happened as a result. So let's see what the Bible says. It says, meanwhile, the famine became so severe that all the food was used up, and people were starving throughout the lands of Egypt and Canaan. By selling grain to the people, Joseph eventually collected all the money in Egypt and Canaan, all of it. And he put the money in Pharaoh's treasury. When the people of Egypt and Canaan ran out of money, all the Egyptians came to Joseph. They said, our money is gone. Please give us food or we'll die before your very eyes. Joseph replied, since all your money is gone, bring me your livestock. I'll give you food in exchange for your livestock. So they brought their livestock to Joseph in exchange for food. In exchange for their horses, flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cattle and donkeys, Joseph provided them with food for another year. But that year ended, and the next year they came again and said, We cannot hide the truth from you, my lord. Our money is gone, and all our livestock and cattle are yours. We have nothing left to give but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your very eyes? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves as slaves to Pharaoh. Just give us grain so we may live and not die, and so the land does not become empty and desolate. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold him their fields because the famine was so severe, and soon all the land belonged to Pharaoh. As for the people, he made them all slaves from one end of Egypt to the other. Now, I believe, much like the Tower of Babel, this isn't simply a historical event that took place, but I believe it's foreshadowing the tribulation period and the time to come, where people are in such dire need of food that they're willing to trade everything in order to get it. And that means their very lives, their freedom itself. And so that explains why, well, some of the people in power now might want to put policies into effect to create a crisis so that they can offer the solution and consolidate power. And I think we're seeing that on a smaller scale now than we will see during the tribulation. Again, I don't plan to be here during the tribulation. If you're a born-again believer in Jesus Christ, I don't believe you'll be here either. But maybe somebody's watching this video on the other side, wondering what's coming, what's going to happen. I think, this is a blueprint of what's likely to happen. And again, Jesus told us that we should expect to see famines leading up to these times. This is from Matthew 24, verses 6 through 8. This is in response to his followers saying, "What are the signs of your coming and the end of the age, the establishment of your kingdom?" So he goes on to explain what those are, and he says, "You will hear of wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in many parts of the world, but all this is only the first of the birth pains, with more to come." In other words, we may see these famines increasing in frequency and intensity leading up to the tribulation period, because there's more to come. We're already seeing birth pains right now and have been for quite some time. But of course, we're seeing those birth pain global events happen with greater frequency and greater intensity. So we would expect famines to follow in this path. So don't be surprised if we see famine in the very near future before the rapture occurs. Again, I'm not saying we're going to see a global famine. I'm not saying we're going to see the Antichrist using that to consolidate power. I'm simply saying Jesus said we would see famines and earthquakes and wars and rumors of wars, all these things taking place. We're seeing many of those things. And when we see some of the news stories we see, where we see China flooding fields that are responsible for 13% of their rice production, which is the food staple of the diet for their 1.4 billion citizens, that's going to put pressure globally on food prices. And China has the ability to bid up those prices. Countries like Japan that import a lot of food but have the wealth to bid for it are going to buy up those available supplies, and the poorer nations will not have that available. And they're going to, unfortunately, likely see famine. If you're in the United States like I am, or another country similar to that, where you have grocery stores that are regularly stocked, they'll probably continue to regularly have food in them. I don't know that we'll see that scenario here in the United States where the store shelves are empty, but you're going to see much higher prices. And so I would encourage you to prepare, because it's important, as the Bible says here in Proverbs 22 verse 3, a prudent person foresees danger and takes precautions. The simpleton goes blindly on and suffers the consequences. Make sure you're prepared for an emergency like this, that you have a deep pantry. We've talked before about that in relation to financial issues and a credit freeze, a global credit freeze, and what that would mean. But we could also see issues with the food supply chain. And so you want to make sure that you take adequate precautions to, shore up any vulnerabilities you may have in regard to where your food comes from. Also, be thinking about people who live in these countries that are on the brink of famine now, that are likely going to be pushed over into the brink of famine as these things play out. What can we do now to prepare to be able to help those people? Is there cash we can put aside to donate to a charity that will take food there? What are the things that we can be doing? Think about food banks where you live and people who can barely afford to buy food now, but they can still get it. But when the price goes up, even though it's available at the store, they may not be able to buy it. What are the things we can be doing to help our neighbors? So when I talk about preparation, I'm not talking about hoarding things and going off by yourself in a cave, looking out for yourself. I'm talking about, yes, you want to take care of yourself so you're in a position of strength to help those around you, to be able to help those around you, right? Think about what Joseph did on the other side. He stored up the grain for 7 years. That put Egypt and Joseph and Pharaoh in a position of strength to help others. Now, it also ended up consolidating massive power for Pharaoh. But if Joseph had not done that, if he had not taken those preparations, then everyone would have starved. So guys, make sure that you're acting prudently. Again, when I see these types of videos and they say, what if the store shelves in the EU had nothing on them? That makes me take a step back and go, I want to make sure, if I live in the EU for sure, that I have my own shelves that are stocked full just in case, because there seems to be a tendency for these things playing out. Just the exact scenarios that they present as it's a hypothetical scenario. Hey, look, it just happened, right? So don't look back at some point in time and go, I should have taken some preparations. And of course, if you don't know Jesus Christ, let me tell you this, you can have all the food in the world in the midst of a global famine, and you will still be in poverty and you will be starving, because there is nothing more important. There's no decision you can make that's more important than your decision regarding Jesus Christ. Guys, we're all sinners. We were born sinners. It means we've fallen short of God's mark of perfection. And the Bible says the wages of sin is death. That means that our sin has caused us to have to pay this penalty of death and have eternal separation from God. That means we're bound for hell. But the good news is that while we were still sinners, God loved us so much that he came down to earth in the form of a man, Jesus of Nazareth, and he went to the cross and he died on the cross and he shed his blood, and then he rose again on the third day, and he paid the price for our sin. He paid off that debt. His blood is a substitute for the penalty we had to pay. He paid the price for us so that we could be free, we could be liberated, we could be reconciled with God. And instead of going to hell, we go to heaven. And guys, that is of eternal consequence, far more important then what may happen here on earth, whether you personally experience a famine or not, is really irrelevant if you don't know Jesus. So make sure, number one, you know Jesus. And if you do, make sure you're sharing the hope you have in Jesus with as many people as possible. Then take some time to make provisions for worst case scenarios, primarily so you're in a position to help other people and so that you can share the gospel with people in that time of crisis. When they say, why is it that you're at peace? You can say, I know Jesus and he's already won the victory. And I know there's nothing to fear. Yeah, there's trials and sorrows in this world, but Jesus has overcome the world. So guys, what do you think? Leave your comments below. Do you think that's just, that's an interesting video they put out? Or do you think they're plotting something in advance, telling us what's going to happen? I don't know. But I do know that what's happened on the ground in China is certainly not going to send food prices lower than they are now. So make sure that you do whatever you need to with that information. Make sure you're sharing the good news of Jesus with others. Make sure to hit the like, share, subscribe, restack buttons, and God willing, I will see you on. If you want to learn more about the end times and Bible prophecy, make sure to visit my Substack at brittgillette.substack.com. There you'll find my latest videos and articles, as well as notes, where I share the latest news headlines, the articles I'm reading, and the videos I'm watching. Subscribe for free, and each new post on Substack will be sent directly to your email. Just scroll to the bottom of the homepage and hit the subscribe button. As an added bonus, your first welcome email will include a link to a copy of my free ebook, 7 Signs of the End Times. Also, make sure to check out all of my books. Just look up Britt Gillette on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple iBooks, Google Books, Kobo, or anywhere books are sold. Thanks for watching today, and until next time, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.